Welcome back to Knowledge is Kings, guys. I am Kings, and today we are going to be making a dining room table. Now, it's a little more advanced than a few of our last projects, but still very doable even if you're a novice. Let's get to it.
So the first thing that you're going to want to do is lay out all your 2x4 boards. So I'm using 2x4 by 6 feet in length. My table is going to be just under 6 feet once I trim off the ends. So if you wanted to make this an 8-foot table, use 8-foot boards. So what I did first was put them all in the clamps, sorted them by putting all of the worst edges down. If there was some wane or huge knots or something that I didn't want, those would go down towards the bottom of the tabletop. I put them in the clamps just so I could verify that without planing them or joining them or anything, there would be no large gaps in there once I clamped them down. I didn't want to take the time to have to plane them down, plus I would need more boards to make up the width that I want. So it all worked out well. There's no real big gaps. So I have all of them in the clamps there. That won't work for the glue up, so what I did was I broke it down into 2 sections, just split it in half, and glued each section in half. I planed the tops and the bottoms of the table down through the thickness planer until all the rounded edges of the 2x4s were gone and the tops were smooth. Once I had both halves planed down to thickness, then I glued both of those halves together. As I clamped those together, I put 2 clamps on both ends right in the middle of the joint to make sure that they stayed perfectly flush on top and bottom. And as they both were put through the thickness planer, I know they're exactly the same thickness, so that'll work out well. So while the glue is drying in the tabletop and the clamps, we're going to start cutting all of our leg components. And so I have 4 4x4s for that. First, you're going to cut 2 of them at 35 inches. Those are going to be the top supports of the table. Then you're going to cut 2 at 11 inches. Those are going to be the spacers for the legs. You're going to cut 2 at 31. That's going to be the bottom of the legs. Then you will cut 4 of them at 18 1/4, and that's actually going to go in between the bottom of the legs and the top supports of the table. When you're cutting the 18 1/4 inch pieces, you want to do them in groups of 2, cutting both of them at the same time. That guarantees that they are both the exact same length, and we've done this before in previous videos, so it's nothing different. Whenever you have 2 components that you need to be absolutely sure that they are the exact same measurement, you want to cut both of them at the same time. Once I have the first set cut, I'm going to mark them so that I remember that these are the 2 that are the same length, while the other 2 are the same length. They're both going to be really close to 18 1/4, but if it's a 30-second off or something, I don't want my table to rock or wobble. This just guarantees that I don't get the 2 pairs mixed up. The next thing we're going to do is cut a 60-degree bevel on the top of the 31-inch piece, and we're going to cut one on both ends to the top of the 31-inch piece. Once you have the bevels cut onto the top of the 31-inch piece, what we're going to do is make a notch in the center of that to receive the stretcher piece that goes between the 2 table legs at the bottom. It keeps them at the right distance apart, and it stops the table from racking. So all we're going to do there is I have it laid out, and I'm actually going to use the miter saw for this. If you don't have a miter saw, you can use a circular saw. Same thing. You just got to set the depth of the blade, and you're going to take a bunch of little passes, one right after another, and I leave about 1/8 of an inch of wood in between each cut. And then once you have all those grooves cut, you can see I'm just taking my fingers and prying back the individual layers until they snap off. And once I get the majority of them, I'm just going to take the claw of my hammer and knock them down closer to the bottom. And then once I get them pretty close, then what I'm going to do here is put it back into the miter saw and just hold the saw down at its lowest depth and move the board back and forth. So here I'm just slowly moving it back and forth as I move the saw blade back a little bit each time, and then move the board back and forth again, and that'll make that bottom perfectly smooth. If you don't want to do this, you can just do it with a chisel and get it as close as you can. And if there's just a tiny little bit in there, it won't make a difference once we put the stretcher board on there. But once you have that done to the 31-inch piece, you're going to go ahead and do that again to the second one. We need one for each set of legs. So the next thing we want to cut is the stretcher that goes between the 2 legs, and I cut this at 50 inches. And then once you have that cut, you're going to put the same 60-degree bevel on the top on both sides, like we did for the 31-incher. Another thing I did here was I sent the 2 bottom 31-inch pieces through the planer a couple times, and that was just to get rid of the rounded part of the 4x4 on the corners. I wanted the bottom of it to be perfectly square, no rounded edges, and the reason for that is I'm going to add a 3.5 by 3.5 inch 3/4 board to the bottom to lift it off the floor. Those pieces will have square edges, and it'll look a lot better when I put it on there if that's square on the bottom as well instead of rounded. Now that all the leg components are cut, I'm just going to set them down on the floor just so I know how it's going to end up looking. And you'll see on the bottom of the legs at the 31-inch piece, I put the two 3.5 by 3.5 blocks that I was talking about. They're not fastened yet. Everything's just loosely sitting there. So this is how one set of legs is going to look. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to glue and screw all the joints together. I'm not going to show the whole thing. I'll just show you this little bit here. So this is how all the joints went together. I glued them first and then screwed in some 5-inch ledger locks, as you can see here. Just make sure to keep everything flush before you screw the ledger lock in there. So this is the bottom here, and as you can see, the two 3.5 by 3.5 pieces that I glued onto the bottom, I screwed in, and I actually just used some 1.5-inch screws for that. I obviously didn't use the big 5-inch ledger locks. I also put in some 4-inch trim screws, and you can see it on the bottom. I screwed it into the 18.25-inch supports there just so the board wouldn't twist or turn, because I only had the one ledger lock in the center so it could still pivot around there, and I added that extra little one in there just so it wouldn't move around. Those are the 3 different screw sizes there that I used just so you could get an idea of what I was using. So 5.5-inch ledger locks, 1.5-inch construction screws, and then 4-inch trim screws. That's all the screws I used on the whole project. The next thing we're going to want to do is cut the notches out on the stretcher piece that goes between the 2 leg sets. And the first cut in there is made 5 inches from the end. And then I'm just going to do the same thing we did for the bottom of the feet, and that is make a bunch of little passes. The only difference here is I'm only going down 1 inch, because I actually want this to sit up a little bit. It gives it a little better look, and it keeps it a little farther away from the floor. Other than that, it's going to be the same process as the other one. You'll notice I had to hold the 4x4 out farther when using the miter saw to flatten out the bottom of my cut there. So once I had the stretcher board notched out on both sides, I fit it into the legs, and it was a very tight fit, which is why I am going to hammer it down, but I don't want to hammer directly on the wood. So I used just a piece of scrap wood I had in the shop just to beat it down. That way that board doesn't get ruined by the hammer. Once the stretcher was in, I put the tabletop upside down on top of the legs. It's very heavy tabletop, 3 inches thick, solid wood there, so it is really heavy. And now the reason I put it upside down is because we're going to be cutting some chamfers around the edge, but I don't want to go all the way through the chamfer to the top from the bottom. I want to leave about 1 inch left over from the top where it's still square, and you can see that's what I'm doing here with the circular saw. So you'll notice with that chamfer there on the bottom, when you're close to the table, it'll give the table appearance of being only 1 inch thick instead of 3 inches, so it doesn't look so overwhelming. Just a small added piece of decoration there, something you certainly don't have to do if you don't want to. So then I went ahead and did that around the entire tabletop, and remember that this is being cut from the bottom. Now when I'm cross cutting here, you'll see that the cut doesn't look like it goes all the way through. And that is because I set it in from the end a little ways so that I could cut it off, because when I glued up my boards, they weren't perfectly aligned left to right with each other. And this way, now that I cut that there, I'll just square up my mark here from where that chamfer ends with the other chamfer from the side. And I'm going to square that line across, and that will give me a perfectly flat end there to the table. So I flipped the table over to make those 2 final cuts. Now the next step is just to sand this table down, and I'm starting off at 80 grit, and I'm going to work my way up to 220. Alright, so I had the sanding done, and as you can see, I already started finishing the table. I already gave the bottom a coat of stain, which I put on there and then wiped off. The top I've already applied a pre-stain, which allows the stain to absorb evenly. If you don't use the pre-stain, you can get a real blotchy look to it, where some spots are darker than others. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is apply the stain to the top, and I'm just going to brush it on real roughly, and then I'm going to use rags to wipe off the excess. Alright, so now that the stain is set up, I am going to be applying polycrylic. It's a food safe varnish as opposed to using like a polyurethane. I'm using a high gloss here, and I'm going to need a few coats. I'll probably put 5 on. So I'm just going to apply the polycrylic with a brush. Once I have the first layer of polycrylic on there and it sets up, I'll take the tabletop off and I'm going to do the bottom. I'm not going to stain the bottom legs. I want to have that contrasting color, but I will put a couple coats of polycrylic on there as well. Although I'm not going to use the high gloss for the legs. It'll be a matte.
Alright guys, so after I got that first layer of polycrylic on there, I brought it up, and I brought it up in 2 pieces. I had the legs and the spacer bar all put together and brought that up. Then I brought the tabletop up, and then I fastened that on with just 4 of these 5-inch ledger lock screws. And these are nice. I don't have to pre-drill or anything. And those just went 1 in each edge of the top rails there. Very simple to put in. Then I am going to end up putting a few more coats of polyacrylic on here, and this project is going to be done. Alright, if you like this project, please like and subscribe, and leave a suggestion in the comments below to a project that you want to see me build. Also, feel free to check out some of my previous videos. Other than that, we'll see you next week for another project.
Oh, I like that.